Forbidden history, the war in heaven before the origin of humanity. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why the world feels broken? Why darkness seems to permeate every corner of existence? Why evil appears to have such a stronghold on humanity? The answer to these questions isn't found in modern philosophy or contemporary theories. It's found in an ancient story that predates human civilization itself. A story so profound, so earth-shattering, that it explains the very foundation of the spiritual battle we witness today. This isn't just another biblical tale. This is the forbidden history that most people never hear about. The war that took place before the first star was ever formed, before the first breath of humanity was ever drawn. A cosmic conflict that shaped not only the heavens but the very destiny of every soul that would ever walk the earth. Today, we're diving deep into the hidden chapters of Scripture. We're going to uncover the truth about the war in heaven, the rebellion that changed everything, and how this ancient battle continues to rage in ways you've never imagined. This story will challenge everything you thought you knew about good and evil, about spiritual warfare, and about your own place in this cosmic drama. So buckle up, because what you're about to discover has been deliberately hidden from mainstream teaching for centuries. The powers that be don't want you to understand the full scope of what happened before humanity's creation. But the truth is there, scattered throughout Scripture, waiting for those brave enough to seek it out. Before time began, before space existed, before the first word of creation was ever spoken, there was perfect order in the heavenly realm. Picture this, a dimension of pure light, where harmony reigned supreme and every created being existed in perfect unity with their creator. This wasn't just some ethereal paradise. This was the command center of the universe, the throne room from which all reality would be governed. In this celestial kingdom, there existed beings of incredible power and beauty, angels of various ranks and orders, each designed for specific purposes, each reflecting different aspects of divine glory. These weren't the chubby cherubs you see in Renaissance paintings. These were mighty warriors, brilliant messengers, and powerful administrators of cosmic law. Among these heavenly beings stood one who surpassed them all in beauty, wisdom, and authority. His name was Lucifer, which means light-bearer or morning star. Scripture describes him as the anointed cherub who covers, positioned at the very throne of God himself. This wasn't just any angel. This was the highest-ranking created being in all existence, second only to the Creator himself. Ezekiel chapter 28 gives us a glimpse into Lucifer's original design. He was perfect in beauty, covered with precious stones, and his very body was like a musical instrument crafted by divine hands. Every step he took produced heavenly music. He walked among the stones of fire, moving freely in the presence of the Almighty. This being was the pinnacle of creation, the masterpiece of divine craftsmanship. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Somewhere in the perfection of eternity past, something began to stir in Lucifer's heart. It started small, like a whisper in the back of his mind, a thought that should never have been entertained, a desire that would ultimately reshape the entire cosmic order. The Bible tells us that iniquity was found in him, not placed there by God, not programmed into his design, but discovered within his own heart. What was this iniquity? Pride, the deadliest of all spiritual diseases. The cancer that would metastasize throughout creation and bring corruption to everything it touched. You see, Lucifer began to contemplate his own beauty, his own power, his own position. He started to focus not on the glory of his creator, but on his own glory. And in that moment of self-obsession, pride took root. He began to think thoughts that no created being should ever think. Thoughts like, why should I serve when I could rule? Why should I reflect glory when I could possess it? Why should I worship when I could be worshipped? Isaiah chapter 14 records the 5 declarations that marked Lucifer's complete rebellion. 5 statements that would echo through eternity as the manifesto of cosmic treason. I will ascend into heaven, he declared. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Do you hear the repetition? 5 times, Lucifer declared, I will. This wasn't just rebellion. This was a calculated coup attempt, a systematic plan to overthrow the government of heaven and establish himself as the supreme ruler of all creation. But Lucifer's rebellion didn't happen in isolation. This wasn't a lone wolf operation. Scripture reveals that he managed to convince a full third of the heavenly host to join his insurrection. Think about that for a moment. 1/3 of all angels, beings who had experienced the direct presence of God, who had witnessed his glory firsthand, who had perfect knowledge of his character and power, chose to follow Lucifer in rebellion. How did this happen? How could beings with perfect knowledge make such a catastrophically wrong choice? The answer lies in understanding the nature of free will and the power of deception. Even in perfection, even with full knowledge, created beings still possess the ability to choose. And Lucifer, with his incredible charisma and persuasive power, painted a picture of a better way, a new order where they wouldn't have to bow before anyone. He promised them positions of power in his new kingdom. He convinced them that God was holding them back, keeping them from reaching their full potential. He made rebellion seem not just reasonable, but noble. The very same lies he would later use on humanity, he first perfected on his fellow angels. But here's what Lucifer and his followers failed to understand. There can only be one source of ultimate authority in the universe. There can only be one creator, one supreme being, one God. Their rebellion wasn't just morally wrong, it was cosmically impossible. They were attempting to overthrow the very foundation of reality itself. The war that followed was unlike anything the universe had ever witnessed. This wasn't a battle with conventional weapons. This was a spiritual conflict fought with powers and forces beyond human comprehension. Revelation chapter 12 gives us a glimpse into this cosmic showdown. Michael the Archangel, leading the loyal angels, engaged in direct combat with the dragon and his angels. The battle raged throughout the heavenly realm. Light clashed against darkness. Loyalty fought against rebellion. Truth warred against deception. But the outcome was never really in doubt. No matter how powerful Lucifer had become, no matter how many angels he had recruited, no matter how carefully he had planned his coup, he was still a created being attempting to overthrow his creator. The defeat was swift and decisive. Scripture tells us that there was no longer any place found for them in heaven. Lucifer and his rebellious army were cast out, expelled from the presence of God, banished from the realm of light and holiness. Jesus himself testified to witnessing this great expulsion, saying he saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. But here's where the story becomes even more significant for us. The war in heaven didn't end with Lucifer's defeat. It simply changed locations. Cast out of heaven, the rebel angels found themselves with access to a new realm, the physical universe that God was about to create. And at the center of this new creation would be a special planet called Earth, populated by creatures made in God's own image. The stage was now set for the next phase of this cosmic conflict. Heaven had been purged of rebellion, but Earth was about to become the new battlefield. And we, as human beings, would find ourselves right in the middle of a war that began before we ever existed. This brings us to a crucial understanding that most people miss. The spiritual battle we face today isn't some new development. It's not a recent phenomenon that started with human sin. It's the continuation of an ancient war that predates our species by eons. The same pride that corrupted Lucifer, the same rebellion that split heaven, the same deception that turned angels into demons is still at work in our world today. When we look at the chaos around us, the evil that seems to permeate every level of society, the darkness that touches every human heart, we're not seeing something random or accidental. We're seeing the ongoing effects of the war in heaven. We're witnessing the continued rebellion of beings who chose to oppose their Creator and now seek to corrupt everything He holds dear. The enemy that humanity faces isn't just some abstract concept of evil. It's a real, intelligent, powerful being who once walked in the presence of God Himself. He knows the divine plan intimately. He understands spiritual laws and cosmic principles, and he has had millennia to perfect his tactics of deception and destruction. But here's what we must never forget. He's still a defeated foe. The war in heaven ended with his expulsion. His rebellion failed. His coup was crushed. And though he continues to rage and fight and deceive, his ultimate fate is already sealed. The question isn't whether good will triumph over evil. The question is whether we, as individuals, will choose the winning side. This ancient conflict helps explain so much about the human condition. Why do we have an innate sense of right and wrong? Because we're caught in the middle of a cosmic battle between righteousness and rebellion. Why do we struggle with pride and selfishness? Because we're infected with the same spiritual disease that corrupted Lucifer. Why does evil seem so attractive and deceptive? Because it's being promoted by beings who have had eons to perfect their craft. Understanding the war in heaven isn't just about satisfying historical curiosity. It's about understanding the very nature of the battle we face every day. Every temptation we encounter, every moral choice we make, every spiritual struggle we experience is connected to this ancient conflict. We're not just living our individual lives. We're participating in a cosmic drama that began before time and will continue until the final victory is achieved. The rebellion in heaven also reveals something profound about the nature of choice and consequence. Even beings with perfect knowledge, perfect environment, and perfect opportunity can still choose wrongly. Free will, by its very nature, includes the possibility of rebellion. And once that choice is made, there are consequences that ripple through eternity. This is why the stakes of our own choices are so incredibly high. We're not just deciding what to have for breakfast or which career to pursue. We're choosing sides in a cosmic war. We're aligning ourselves either with the Creator or with the rebel. There is no neutral ground in this conflict. Silence is complicity. Indecision is decision. As we continue this journey together, we'll explore how this heavenly war spilled over into the earthly realm. We'll discover how the same tactics used to deceive angels were later employed against humanity. We'll uncover the hidden strategies of both sides in this ongoing conflict. And most importantly, we'll learn how we can position ourselves on the side of ultimate victory. The war in heaven wasn't just ancient history. It was the opening battle in a conflict that continues to shape every aspect of our existence. The enemy may have been cast out of heaven, but his influence on earth has only just begun. And understanding this hidden history is the key to understanding everything that follows in the human story. So stay with me as we dig deeper into these forbidden truths. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than most people realize, and what we discover next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the spiritual realm and our place within it. The moment Lucifer and his rebellious army were cast from heaven, something extraordinary happened to the physical realm. The earth, which had been created as a perfect jewel in God's cosmic crown, suddenly became shrouded in darkness and chaos. Genesis tells us that the earth became without form and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. But this wasn't the original state of creation. This was the aftermath of cosmic warfare. Think about it. When God creates something, Scripture consistently tells us it is good. Yet here we find the earth in a state of complete desolation. The The Hebrew words used here, tohu wabohu, don't just mean empty. They carry the connotation of judgment, of destruction, of something that was once ordered becoming chaotic. This wasn't God creating a mess and then fixing it. This was the collateral damage from the greatest spiritual battle ever fought. The fallen angels, now transformed into demons, had been given access to the physical realm, and their first act was to corrupt and destroy everything they could touch. The perfect order that God had established was twisted into chaos. The light was extinguished, leaving only darkness. The harmony was shattered, leaving only discord. But here's where we see the incredible nature of our Creator. Instead of scrapping the whole project and starting over, God chose to restore and redeem. The very first recorded words of divine action after this cosmic catastrophe were, "Let there be light." Not just physical light, but the beginning of a restoration process that would ultimately culminate in the redemption of all creation. This restoration wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about establishing a new battleground where the ultimate victory over rebellion would be achieved. Earth wasn't just being restored, it was being prepared for the next phase of the cosmic conflict. And at the center of this new phase would be creatures unlike any that had ever existed before. Human beings made in the very image of God. Now, you might wonder why God would create humanity, knowing full well that we would become targets in this spiritual war. Why would He place us in harm's way? The answer reveals something profound about the divine strategy. Humanity wasn't created to be victims in this conflict. We were created to be the instrument of Satan's ultimate defeat. You see, the angels who rebelled did so with full knowledge of God's glory and power. They had direct, immediate access to divine truth. Their rebellion was, in a sense, unforgivable because it was committed with perfect understanding. But humanity would be different. We would be created with limited knowledge, in a fallen world, surrounded by deception. Our choices would be made in faith rather than sight. This is why the stakes of human decision-making are so incredibly high. When we choose to follow God despite not seeing Him directly, despite living in a corrupted world, despite facing constant deception from the enemy, our loyalty means something different than angelic loyalty ever could. We're choosing God not because we have to, not because we've seen His glory directly, but because we trust Him despite the circumstances. The creation of humanity was, in essence, God's masterstroke in the cosmic chess game. Satan thought he had won something significant by corrupting the earth and establishing his influence in the physical realm. What he didn't realize is that he had walked directly into a trap that would ultimately lead to his complete and final defeat. But before we get to humanity's creation, we need to understand what happened to Lucifer himself during this transition from heavenly rebel to earthly adversary. The being who had once been the most beautiful creature in heaven was now transformed into something hideous. His name changed from Lucifer, the light bearer, to Satan, the adversary. His purpose shifted from reflecting God's glory to opposing everything God represented. This transformation wasn't just cosmetic, it was fundamental. Sin doesn't just stain, it corrupts at the deepest level. The pride that had started as a small seed in Lucifer's heart had now grown into a consuming obsession. He was no longer capable of creating, only destroying. No longer capable of building up, only tearing down. No longer capable of love, only hatred. And yet, despite this transformation, Satan retained much of his original power and intelligence. He was still a cherub, still possessed of incredible abilities and knowledge. He understood spiritual laws and cosmic principles. He had witnessed the creative process firsthand. He knew the divine plan in ways that we can barely comprehend. This is what makes him such a formidable adversary. We're not dealing with some cartoon devil with horns and a pitchfork. We're facing an enemy who once held the highest position in heaven, who understands the spiritual realm intimately, and who has had millennia to study human nature and perfect his tactics of deception. The other fallen angels underwent similar transformations. These beings who had once been ministers of God's grace became agents of destruction. Their knowledge of heavenly things became weapons used against God's people. Their understanding of spiritual laws became tools for manipulation and deception. Together, they established what Scripture calls the kingdom of darkness. This wasn't just a metaphorical concept. It was an actual spiritual government with hierarchies, territories, and specific assignments. Paul describes it in Ephesians as principalities and powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual wickedness in high places. This is an organized, systematic opposition to God's kingdom. The earth became their headquarters, their base of operations for the ongoing war against heaven. And from this base, they began to plan their next move. They couldn't attack heaven directly anymore. They had been cast out and could never return. But they could attack something that God valued even more than angels, the human race that was about to be created. This brings us to a crucial understanding that most people miss entirely. The spiritual battle we face isn't some abstract conflict between good and evil concepts. It's a very real war between organized kingdoms. On one side, the kingdom of heaven with God at the head and faithful angels as his army. On the other side, the kingdom of darkness with Satan as the usurper king and demons as his forces. We, as human beings, are caught in the middle of this conflict. But we're not just innocent bystanders. We're the prize that both sides are fighting for. Our allegiance, our worship, our souls are what this war is ultimately about. Satan knows that he can't defeat God directly. But he believes that if he can corrupt God's image bearers, if he can turn humanity against their creator, he can inflict a wound on the divine heart that will somehow constitute victory. This is why the enemy is so obsessed with human beings. This is why every culture throughout history has been infiltrated with spiritual deception. This is why there's such a concentrated effort to pull people away from God. We're not just random casualties in a cosmic conflict. We're the specific target that the entire war is designed to capture. But here's what Satan didn't count on. God's love for humanity runs so deep that he was willing to enter the battlefield himself. The creation of human beings wasn't just about making new creatures to populate the earth. It was about setting up the conditions for the ultimate demonstration of divine love and the final defeat of rebellion. The earth, now under the influence of the kingdom of darkness, was about to become the stage for the greatest story ever told. A story of love conquering hate, light overcoming darkness, and humble obedience triumphing over prideful rebellion. The war that began in heaven was about to enter its most critical phase. As we prepare to explore humanity's entrance into this cosmic drama, we need to understand that our story doesn't begin with the Garden of Eden. It begins with the war in heaven. Our very existence is connected to this ancient conflict. Our purpose is defined by this ongoing battle, and our destiny will be determined by which side we choose in this ultimate struggle between good and evil. The fallen angels had established their kingdom on earth. They had corrupted the physical realm and shrouded it in darkness. They had organized their forces and prepared their strategies. They thought they had gained the upper hand in their rebellion against heaven. What they didn't realize is that God was about to introduce a new player into the game. A creature so unique, so beloved, so strategically important that their very existence would change the entire nature of the conflict. The stage was set, the battlefield was prepared, the enemy was in position, and now, in the midst of this cosmic war zone, God was about to create something that would ultimately lead to Satan's complete and final defeat. But that creation would also become the target of the most intense spiritual assault in the history of the universe. The war in heaven was over, but the war for humanity was just beginning. And what happened next would determine not just the fate of the human race, but the ultimate outcome of the cosmic rebellion that started before time began. The enemy thought he had won by corrupting the earth, but he had actually just walked into the trap that would seal his eternal doom. But humanity's creation wasn't just about adding new players to this cosmic battlefield. It was about revealing something that would shake the very foundations of Satan's rebellion. Something that would expose the fundamental flaw in his entire worldview and ultimately lead to his complete humiliation. You see, when God decided to create human beings, he didn't just make another type of creature. He made something unprecedented in all of creation. He made beings in his own image. Think about what this means. Angels, no matter how powerful or beautiful, were created as servants. They reflected God's glory, but they were not made in his image. Humanity was different. We were created to be God's representatives on earth, his ambassadors, his children. This wasn't just a title or a position. This was an ontological reality. Humans possess something that even the highest angels lacked: the capacity for genuine relationship with the Creator. We weren't just servants or messengers. We were family. And this family status came with privileges and responsibilities that no other created being had ever possessed. The implications of this were staggering. Satan, in all his pride and arrogance, had never been offered the kind of intimate relationship with God that was being freely given to these new creatures made from dust. The very beings he considered inferior to himself were being elevated to a status he had never achieved, even at the height of his power in heaven. But there was something even more profound happening here. God wasn't just creating humans to be his children. He was creating them to be the instruments through which the cosmic rebellion would be ultimately defeated. The enemy thought he had gained an advantage by corrupting the earth, but God was about to use that very corruption as the backdrop for the greatest demonstration of love and power the universe had ever witnessed. This is where the story takes a turn that reveals the incredible depth of divine strategy. God placed the first humans, Adam and Eve, in a perfect environment called the Garden of Eden. But this wasn't just a nice place for them to live. It was a testing ground, a place where the cosmic conflict would play out on a human scale. The garden represented everything that heaven had been before the rebellion. Perfect order, perfect harmony, perfect relationship between the created and the creator. But unlike the original heaven, this paradise existed in the physical realm, right in the middle of territory that Satan now considered his own. It was, in essence, an outpost of heaven established on enemy-occupied territory. And here's where God's master plan becomes visible. He gave Adam and Eve something that the angels had never possessed: the potential for moral growth through choice. The angels were created with fixed natures. Once they chose rebellion or loyalty, that choice became permanent. But humans were different. We were created with the capacity to learn, to grow, to become more than we started as. This is why there was a tree in the garden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't there as a trap or a temptation. It was there as an opportunity. An opportunity for humanity to choose loyalty to God, not out of ignorance, but out of genuine love and trust. The presence of that tree made moral choice possible, and moral choice made genuine relationship possible. Satan saw this setup and thought he had found his opportunity for revenge. If he could corrupt these new image bearers, if he could turn them against their creator, just as he had turned the angels against theirs, he could strike back at God in a way that would truly wound the divine heart. He could prove that even God's most beloved creatures would ultimately choose rebellion when given the option. But what Satan didn't understand was that this was exactly what God wanted him to think. The enemy was being drawn into a trap that would ultimately expose the bankruptcy of his entire philosophy and lead to his final defeat. God wasn't just creating humans to be his children. He was creating them to be the means by which the cosmic rebellion would be turned back on itself. The stage was now set for the most critical battle in the history of the universe. Not a battle fought with supernatural powers in heavenly realms, but a battle fought in the heart and mind of human beings. A battle where the weapons would be truth versus deception, love versus selfishness, trust versus pride. Satan approached this new phase of the conflict with confidence. After all, he had successfully corrupted a third of the angels in heaven itself. How difficult could it be to corrupt these creatures made from dirt? He had witnessed their creation, studied their nature, observed their weaknesses. He knew exactly which buttons to push, which desires to exploit, which fears to manipulate. What he failed to realize was that humanity's apparent weakness was actually their greatest strength. The very fact that we were created with limitations, with the capacity for doubt and struggle, meant that our choices would carry a weight that angelic choices never could. When we choose to trust God despite not being able to see him directly, despite living in a fallen world, despite facing constant opposition, that choice means something profound. The demons who had followed Satan in his rebellion began to position themselves for this new phase of the war. They studied human nature, looking for points of vulnerability. They developed strategies of temptation and deception, specifically designed for these new creatures. They prepared to launch the most concentrated spiritual assault in the history of creation. But even as they planned and schemed, they were walking deeper into the trap that God had set for them. Every strategy they developed, every weakness they exploited, every victory they thought they had achieved was actually serving a larger purpose that they couldn't see. The Creator was allowing them just enough success to draw them into a position where their ultimate defeat would be both complete and humiliating. The first humans lived in innocence, unaware of the cosmic drama swirling around them. They walked with God in the cool of the evening, enjoyed perfect relationship with each other, and exercised dominion over the earth as God's appointed representatives. But this innocence wasn't ignorance, it was purity. They knew God intimately, trusted him completely, and found their identity in their relationship with him. This perfect state of affairs was intolerable to Satan. Here were creatures enjoying the very thing he had forfeited through his rebellion: intimate fellowship with the Creator. Here were beings exercising the authority on earth that he coveted for himself. Here was everything he had lost, being freely given to creatures he considered beneath him. The temptation that followed wasn't just about getting humans to eat forbidden fruit. It was about proving that God's love was misplaced, that his trust was foolish, that his entire plan for creation was fundamentally flawed. Satan wasn't just trying to corrupt two people. He was trying to vindicate his rebellion and prove that he had been right to challenge God's authority in the first place. He approached Eve with the same lies he had used on the angels in heaven. He questioned God's word, suggesting that the Creator was withholding something good from his creatures. He appealed to pride, promising that disobedience would make them like God. He offered knowledge and power in exchange for rebellion, painting God as a jealous tyrant who didn't want his creatures to reach their full potential. And tragically, the first humans made the same choice that the angels had made. They chose to trust the creature rather than the Creator. They chose to seek their own glory rather than reflect God's glory. They chose rebellion over relationship, pride over humility, self-will over surrender. But here's where the story takes a turn that Satan never saw coming. When the angels rebelled, they were immediately cast out of heaven with no possibility of redemption. Their choice was final, their fate sealed. But when humans rebelled, something different happened. Instead of immediate judgment, there was immediate mercy. Instead of expulsion, there was a promise of redemption. Right there in the garden, in the very moment of humanity's greatest failure, God announced his plan for ultimate victory. He told the serpent that the seed of the woman would one day crush his head. It was a cryptic prophecy, but it carried a promise that would echo through all of human history. The rebellion would not have the final word. This is where Satan realized he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. By corrupting humanity, he thought he had struck a blow against God that would somehow constitute victory. Instead, he had triggered a response that would ultimately lead to his complete and final defeat. The corruption of humanity wasn't Satan's victory. It was the opening move in God's ultimate strategy for ending the rebellion once and for all. The war that had begun in heaven had now fully engaged the earth. But the rules of engagement had changed in ways that would ultimately favor the Creator. The same love that had motivated God to create humanity in the first place would now motivate him to redeem them. And that redemption would require a demonstration of divine love so profound, so costly, so complete, that it would forever settle the question of God's character that Satan's rebellion had raised. The enemy thought he had won by corrupting the first humans. What he had actually done was set in motion the very process that would seal his eternal doom. The war in heaven had been about challenging God's authority. The war on earth would be about revealing God's love. And love, as it turns out, is a weapon that no amount of pride or rebellion can ultimately withstand. The cosmic conflict had entered its most critical phase. The battlefield was no longer the pristine halls of heaven, but the messy, complicated world of human experience. The weapons were no longer supernatural powers, but the choices made by creatures caught between two kingdoms. And the outcome, though it would take millennia to fully unfold, had already been determined by a love that was willing to go to any length to rescue its beloved. Satan's rebellion had seemed to gain momentum with the fall of humanity, but in reality, it had just triggered the beginning of the end. The war that started with pride in heaven would end with humility on earth. The conflict that began with a creature trying to exalt himself above his creator would conclude with the creator humbling himself below his creatures. And in that ultimate act of love and sacrifice, the cosmic rebellion would be forever defeated, and the rightful order of creation would be eternally established. The war in heaven was over, but its echoes would reverberate through every page of human history until the final victory was achieved. The deception that Satan employed in the garden wasn't just a simple trick. It was the culmination of eons of strategic planning, the deployment of psychological warfare tactics that he had been perfecting since his original rebellion. When he approached Eve, he wasn't just testing humanity's obedience, he was attempting to prove that his original rebellion had been justified. Think about the sophistication of his approach. He didn't come as a terrifying demon or an obvious enemy. He disguised himself as a serpent, one of God's own creatures. He embedded his lies within questions that seemed reasonable. He made rebellion appear not as defiance, but as enlightenment. This wasn't amateur hour temptation. This was master-level manipulation by a being who had once stood in the presence of the Almighty. But here's what makes this moment so crucial to understanding the entire cosmic conflict. Satan's temptation of humanity revealed the core philosophy behind his rebellion. When he told Eve that she would be like God, knowing good and evil, he was essentially saying that God had been withholding something beneficial from his creatures. He was suggesting that the Creator was selfish, jealous, and manipulative. This accusation strikes at the very heart of who God is. It challenges his character, his motives, his love. And this is what the entire cosmic conflict has always been about. It's not just about who gets to be in charge. It's about whether God is truly good, whether his authority is legitimate, whether his love is genuine. Satan's rebellion wasn't just political, it was theological. He wasn't just challenging God's power, he was challenging God's character. and by extension, he was challenging the entire foundation upon which the universe operates. If God is not perfectly good, perfectly loving, perfectly just, then the whole cosmic order is built on a lie. This is why the human response to Satan's temptation was so monumentally significant. When Adam and Eve chose to believe the serpent's lies over God's truth, they weren't just making a bad decision about fruit. They were essentially voting on the character of God. They were choosing to believe that their Creator was indeed withholding good from them, that His commands were restrictive rather than protective, that His love was conditional rather than perfect. The fall of humanity wasn't just about individual sin. It was about cosmic treason on the deepest possible level. It was about creatures made in God's image joining the rebellion against their Creator. It was about the corruption of the very beings who were supposed to represent God's character on earth. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that reveals the true genius of divine strategy. The moment humanity fell, God could have responded with immediate judgment. He could have destroyed Adam and Eve on the spot and started over. He could have vindicated His authority through displays of power and wrath. Instead, He did something that stunned both heaven and hell. He promised redemption. Right there in the garden, speaking to the serpent who had orchestrated this cosmic catastrophe, God announced that the seed of the woman would one day crush the serpent's head. It was cryptic, mysterious, but it carried a promise that would change everything. The rebellion would not have the final word. Love would find a way. This promise wasn't just good news for humanity. It was a declaration of war against the kingdom of darkness. Satan thought he had won a decisive victory by corrupting God's image bearers. Instead, he had triggered a response that would ultimately lead to his complete destruction. The corruption of humanity wasn't the end of God's plan. It was the beginning of an even greater plan. You see, God could have created beings who were incapable of sin, creatures who had no choice but to obey. But such creatures would also be incapable of genuine love, genuine faith, genuine relationship. Love requires choice. Faith requires the possibility of doubt. Relationship requires the freedom to accept or reject. By allowing humanity to fall, God wasn't failing to protect His creation. He was setting up the conditions for something far more magnificent than innocence, redemption. He was creating the opportunity for creatures who had chosen rebellion to choose love instead. He was making possible a relationship based not on ignorance, but on grace, not on perfection, but on forgiveness. This is where Satan's understanding of divine character proved to be fatally flawed. He assumed that God's response to rebellion would be the same as his own: anger, vengeance, destruction. He couldn't comprehend a love so deep that it would pursue the beloved even into their rebellion. He couldn't fathom a grace so profound that it would pay any price to restore broken relationships. The promise of redemption revealed something about God's character that neither angels nor demons had ever fully understood. His love wasn't conditional on perfect obedience. His grace wasn't limited by the failures of His creatures. His commitment to relationship was stronger than their commitment to rebellion. But this redemption wouldn't be cheap or easy. The promise made in the garden carried implications that wouldn't be fully understood for thousands of years. The seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head would have to enter the battlefield personally. God Himself would have to become human, would have to face the same temptations that had destroyed the first humans, would have to succeed where they had failed. And more than that, He would have to pay the price for their failure. The justice of God demanded that rebellion be punished. The love of God demanded that the rebels be saved. The only way to satisfy both justice and love was for God Himself to bear the punishment that His creatures deserved. This is what Satan never saw coming. He thought he understood the rules of cosmic justice. He assumed that rebellion would always result in destruction, that broken law would always demand punishment of the lawbreaker. What he failed to anticipate was the possibility of substitution. The The concept of someone else paying the price, the revolutionary idea of vicarious atonement. The war that had begun with Satan's prideful attempt to exalt himself above God would ultimately be won through God's humble willingness to lower himself below his creatures. The conflict that started with rebellion in the heights of heaven would be resolved through sacrifice in the depths of human suffering. As the centuries unfolded after the fall, this cosmic drama began to play out on the stage of human history. Every generation would face the same choice that the first humans had faced: trust God or trust the lies of the enemy. Every individual would have to decide whether to believe in the character of their creator or to join the rebellion against him. Satan continued his campaign of deception, working tirelessly to corrupt every human heart, to turn every soul away from their creator. He established systems of false religion, built empires based on pride and power, created philosophies that denied the existence or relevance of God. He was relentless in his efforts to prove that his original rebellion had been justified. But God was equally relentless in his pursuit of redemption. Through prophets and priests, through signs and wonders, through law and covenant, he continued to reveal his character to humanity. He demonstrated his faithfulness despite their unfaithfulness, his love despite their rebellion, his grace despite their sin. Every act of divine mercy was a blow against Satan's accusations. Every demonstration of God's love was evidence against the enemy's lies. Every moment of grace was proof that the Creator's character was exactly the opposite of what the serpent had claimed in the garden. The cosmic conflict was no longer being fought primarily in the spiritual realm. It had moved into the arena of human experience, where every act of faith was a vote for God's character and every act of rebellion was a vote for Satan's accusations. Humanity had become both the battlefield and the prize in this ultimate struggle between good and evil. But the war was far from over. Satan still controlled significant territory in the human heart. Death still reigned as the consequence of sin. The promise of redemption remained just that, a promise. The seed of the woman had not yet appeared. The serpent's head had not yet been crushed. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. The cosmic conflict that had begun in the perfection of heaven would reach its climax in the brokenness of earth. The love of God would be tested to its absolute limits. The character of the Creator would be revealed once and for all. And when that moment finally came, when the promised seed finally appeared, the universe would witness something that no created being had ever imagined possible. The Creator would become creature. The infinite would become finite. The Word would become flesh. And in that ultimate act of humility and love, the rebellion that had torn the cosmos apart would finally meet its match. The war in heaven had been about power. The war on earth would be about love. And love, as the universe was about to discover, is the most powerful force in all creation. It's a force that can transform rebels into children, enemies into friends, and defeat into victory. But that transformation wouldn't happen without cost. The price of redemption would be higher than anyone imagined. The victory over rebellion would require a sacrifice so profound, so complete, that it would echo through eternity as the ultimate demonstration of divine love. The cosmic conflict was approaching its turning point. The ancient war was about to enter its final phase, and neither heaven nor hell was prepared for what God was about to do to win back the hearts of his beloved creatures and defeat the rebellion once and for all. The enemy thought he understood the rules of the game. He was about to discover that love plays by different rules entirely, rules that would transform the very nature of the conflict and guarantee that the last word would belong not to pride, but to grace. The centuries that followed humanity's fall witnessed something unprecedented in the cosmic conflict. While Satan celebrated what he believed was his greatest victory, God began implementing a strategy so complex, so counterintuitive, that even the wisest angels struggled to comprehend it. The Creator wasn't just planning to fix what was broken. He was orchestrating a master plan that would use the very corruption Satan had introduced to achieve an even greater purpose. You have to understand, this wasn't damage control. This wasn't God scrambling to salvage a failed experiment. This was the unfolding of a plan so magnificent, so all-encompassing, that it had been conceived before the first star was ever formed. The fall of humanity hadn't caught God off guard. It had activated a protocol that would ultimately demonstrate the depths of divine love in ways that no other method could achieve. As generations passed, Satan worked tirelessly to corrupt every aspect of human civilization. He inspired violence, fueled hatred, promoted injustice, and established systems of oppression designed to turn people away from their Creator. Every war, every act of cruelty, every moment of despair was another argument in his case against God's character. Look, he seemed to be saying to the watching universe, look at what becomes of creatures who trust this so-called loving God. But God's response to this campaign of destruction revealed something about divine strategy that left both angels and demons astounded. Instead of abandoning humanity to their fate, instead of starting over with a new creation, God began working within the corruption to bring about redemption. He took the very mess that Satan had created and began weaving it into a tapestry of grace that would ultimately showcase his glory more brilliantly than any perfect creation ever could. This is where we see the profound difference between divine wisdom and created intelligence. Satan, despite all his knowledge and experience, could only think in terms of destruction and corruption. He could tear down, but he couldn't truly build up. He could poison, but he couldn't heal. He could accuse, but he couldn't redeem. His rebellion had fundamentally limited his ability to create anything genuinely good or beautiful. God, on the other hand, possessed the unique ability to bring good out of evil, light out of darkness, beauty out of ashes. He wasn't just more powerful than Satan. He was operating on an entirely different level of existence. Where Satan saw only problems, God saw opportunities. Where Satan created chaos, God orchestrated symphony. Where Satan brought death, God was preparing to demonstrate life in its fullest form. The human story that unfolded over the millennia became a living laboratory where these competing philosophies were tested. Every act of faith was evidence for God's case. Every demonstration of love in the midst of hatred was a testimony to divine character. Every moment when light pierced darkness was proof that Satan's accusations were false. But perhaps most significantly, every instance of human failure paradoxically became an opportunity to demonstrate divine grace. When people fell short, when they sinned, when they rebelled, God's response wasn't condemnation but compassion. His love wasn't deterred by their failures. It was revealed through his willingness to forgive and restore. This pattern of grace in the face of rebellion became the central theme of human history. Noah found grace despite the wickedness of his generation. Abraham was called friend of God, despite his moments of doubt and deception. David was described as a man after God's own heart, despite his adultery and murder. The pattern was clear. God's love wasn't based on human perfection, but on divine character. Each of these demonstrations of grace was like a hammer blow against Satan's accusations. Every time God showed mercy instead of judgment, every time he offered forgiveness instead of condemnation, every time he pursued the rebellious instead of abandoning them, the enemy's case grew weaker. The universe was witnessing firsthand that God's character was exactly the opposite of what Satan had claimed. But the enemy wasn't passive during this process. He worked relentlessly to corrupt every expression of divine grace, to twist every revelation of God's character, to turn every opportunity for redemption into an occasion for greater rebellion. He inspired false religions that painted God as cruel and demanding. He established systems of legalism that made divine love seem conditional and performance-based. He promoted philosophies that denied God's existence or relevance entirely. The spiritual battle intensified with each passing generation. It wasn't just being fought in the invisible realm anymore. It was being waged in human hearts and minds, in the choices people made every day, in the way civilizations rose and fell. Every human decision was a vote in this cosmic referendum on God's character. As the centuries progressed, something remarkable began to emerge from the chaos. Despite Satan's best efforts to corrupt everything, pockets of light began to appear in the darkness. Communities of people who chose to trust God despite their circumstances. Individuals who demonstrated love in the face of hatred, hope in the midst of despair, faith in the presence of doubt. These beacons of light weren't perfect people. They were broken, flawed, struggling human beings who had encountered something that transcended their circumstances. They had experienced a love that was stronger than their failures, a grace that was deeper than their sin, a hope that was more enduring than their suffering. Each of these communities, each of these individuals became a living testimony to the truth about God's character. They were proof that Satan's accusations were false, that God's love was real, that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. They were harbingers of something greater that was coming, previews of a victory that would ultimately vindicate divine character once and for all. But the enemy's response to these demonstrations of divine grace was to intensify his attacks. If he couldn't prevent people from experiencing God's love, he would work to corrupt their understanding of it. If he couldn't stop God from revealing his character, he would distort the revelation. If he couldn't prevent redemption, he would make it seem cheap and meaningless. This is where we see the true sophistication of Satan's strategy. He wasn't just promoting obvious evil anymore. He was promoting counterfeits of good. He wasn't just encouraging people to reject God outright. He was encouraging them to accept false versions of God that were easier to live with but ultimately destructive. He wasn't just spreading lies. He was mixing truth with deception in ways that made the lies seem reasonable and the truth seem extreme. The cosmic conflict had evolved into something far more complex than the original rebellion in heaven. It was no longer just about who would be in charge. It was about the very nature of reality itself. What is love? What is justice? What is truth? These weren't just philosophical questions anymore. They were the battleground on which the fate of the universe was being decided. Every human life became a microcosm of this larger conflict. Every person faced the same choice that the angels had faced in heaven, and that Adam and Eve had faced in the garden. Trust the Creator, or trust the accuser. But now the choice was being made in circumstances that were far more complex, far more challenging, far more revealing of character. This is why human choices carried such weight in the cosmic conflict. When someone chose to trust God, despite not being able to see Him directly, despite living in a world corrupted by sin, despite facing constant opposition from the enemy, that choice said something profound about both human potential and divine character. It proved that God's love was real enough to inspire faith, even in the darkest circumstances. Conversely, when someone chose to reject God, to join the rebellion, to embrace the lies of the enemy, that choice also carried cosmic significance. It seemed to validate Satan's accusations, to support his claim that God's love was conditional, that his authority was illegitimate, that his character was flawed. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Even human rebellion became an opportunity for divine grace to be demonstrated. God's response to human sin wasn't to abandon the rebels, but to pursue them more intensely. His love wasn't diminished by their rejection. It was magnified by his willingness to continue reaching out despite the rejection. This pattern of pursuing the lost, of loving the unlovable, of forgiving the unforgivable, became the signature characteristic of divine love. It wasn't just that God loved good people or that he rewarded obedience. He loved rebels. He pursued enemies. He forgave those who had wronged him. This kind of love was unprecedented in the cosmic order. It was something that no created being had ever imagined possible. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If God loved his enemies, if he pursued rebels, if he forgave the unforgivable, then the entire foundation of Satan's rebellion was built on a lie. The enemy had claimed that God was selfish, jealous, and manipulative. But the evidence of human history was pointing in exactly the opposite direction. As this reality began to dawn on the watching universe, the cosmic conflict started to shift in a fundamental way. It was no longer just about power or authority, it was about love itself. The question wasn't just who had the right to rule, but what kind of ruler would be best for all creation. And the evidence was mounting that a ruler motivated by selfless love would be infinitely preferable to one motivated by selfish pride. Satan began to realize that his strategy of corrupting humanity might be backfiring. Every demonstration of divine grace in response to human sin was making his accusations look more and more ridiculous. Every act of divine love in the face of human rebellion was exposing the bankruptcy of his own philosophy. Every moment of divine patience with human failure was revealing the depths of his own pride and hatred. The enemy found himself in an impossible position. If he stopped tempting humans, they might choose God freely, which would validate divine character. If he continued tempting them, God's gracious response to their failures would also validate divine character. Either way, Satan was losing ground in the cosmic conflict, but the adversary wasn't ready to surrender. If he couldn't win through corruption, he would try to win through counterfeiting. If he couldn't prevent people from experiencing God's love, he would offer them cheap substitutes that would ultimately leave them empty and disillusioned. If he couldn't stop God from revealing his character, he would create false revelations that would confuse and mislead. This new phase of the conflict was in many ways more dangerous than the original rebellion. Open warfare is one thing, but deception masquerading as truth is far more insidious. When Satan appeared as an angel of light, when he offered counterfeits of divine grace, when he promoted false versions of redemption, he became far more dangerous than when he simply promoted obvious evil. The stage was being set for the ultimate confrontation. The cosmic conflict had been building toward this moment for millennia. All of history had been preparation for what was about to unfold. The question of God's character, which had been raised by Satan's original rebellion, was about to be answered once and for all. But that answer wouldn't come through displays of power or demonstrations of authority. It would come through the ultimate expression of love. God himself was about to enter the battlefield personally, not as a conquering king, but as a suffering servant. The Creator was about to become creature. The infinite was about to become finite. The Word was about to become flesh. And in that unprecedented act of humility and love, the cosmic rebellion would finally meet its match. The war that began with pride in heaven would end with humility on earth. The conflict that started with a creature trying to exalt himself above his Creator would conclude with the Creator humbling himself below his creatures. The enemy thought he understood the rules of cosmic warfare. He was about to discover that love doesn't play by any rules except its own. And those rules would transform not just the conflict, but the very nature of victory itself. The greatest triumph in the history of the universe would look like the greatest defeat. The ultimate demonstration of power would appear to be the ultimate expression of weakness. Satan's rebellion was about to trigger the very thing that would guarantee its own destruction. By corrupting humanity, he had created the conditions that would make the ultimate revelation of divine love both necessary and possible. The fall had made redemption inevitable, and redemption would prove once and for all that God's character was everything Satan had denied it to be. The cosmic conflict was approaching its climax. The ancient war was about to enter its final phase. And neither heaven nor hell was prepared for the revolutionary way that love was about to redefine victory itself. The moment had arrived. After millennia of cosmic build-up, after countless generations of preparation, after endless demonstrations of divine character in response to human rebellion, God was ready to play his final card. The chess match that began with Lucifer's prideful declaration in heaven was about to reach its endgame. But the move God was preparing to make was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that neither Satan nor his demons could have anticipated it. Throughout history, the enemy had operated under certain assumptions about divine behavior. He believed that God, like himself, was ultimately motivated by self-interest. He assumed that divine love had limits, that divine patience had boundaries, that divine grace had conditions. Every strategy Satan employed was based on these fundamental misunderstandings of God's character. The adversary had watched as God demonstrated mercy to Noah, faithfulness to Abraham, and forgiveness to David. He had witnessed countless acts of divine grace throughout human history. But Satan interpreted these demonstrations as weaknesses rather than strengths. He saw God's patience as indecision, his mercy as inability to execute justice, his love as emotional manipulation. This profound misreading of divine character would prove to be Satan's fatal flaw. He was preparing for a war based on his own nature, his own motivations, his own understanding of power and authority. He expected God to respond to the cosmic rebellion the way he himself would respond, with overwhelming force, with devastating retaliation, with crushing displays of superior strength. Instead, God was preparing to do something that would completely redefine the nature of the conflict. The Creator was about to demonstrate that true power isn't found in domination, but in self-sacrifice, that genuine authority comes not from forcing submission, but from inspiring love, that real victory is achieved not by destroying enemies, but by transforming them into friends. The plan that was about to unfold had been in motion since before the foundation of the world. When Satan corrupted humanity in the garden, he thought he was seizing the initiative in the cosmic conflict. In reality, he was walking directly into a trap that had been prepared for him from eternity past. Every move he had made, every victory he thought he had achieved, had actually been serving a larger purpose that he couldn't see. The incarnation wasn't God's backup plan. It wasn't a desperate measure undertaken because the original strategy had failed. It was the culmination of a design so intricate, so perfectly orchestrated, that it would simultaneously accomplish multiple objectives that seemed mutually exclusive. It would satisfy divine justice while demonstrating divine love. It would punish sin while saving sinners. It would vindicate God's character while providing redemption for rebels. When the Word became flesh, when the infinite squeezed himself into the constraints of human existence, when the Creator became creature, something unprecedented happened in the cosmic order. For the first time since the rebellion began, God and humanity existed on the same level. The gap between Creator and creation was bridged not by elevating humanity to divine status, but by God descending to human experience. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture or a temporary disguise. This was genuine incarnation, complete identification with the human condition. The being who had spoken galaxies into existence was now dependent on human parents for survival. The one who commanded legions of angels was now subject to human limitations. The source of all life was now vulnerable to death. Satan watched these developments with a mixture of confusion and anticipation. On one hand, this seemed like an unprecedented opportunity. If he could corrupt, tempt, or destroy this divine human being, he would achieve a victory beyond his wildest dreams. He would prove once and for all that even God himself couldn't maintain perfect obedience under the conditions of human existence. On the other hand, something about this whole scenario made the enemy deeply uneasy. There was a quality to this incarnation that he couldn't quite identify, a sense that he was missing something crucial about what was really happening. The very fact that God would voluntarily limit himself in this way suggested a confidence, a certainty of victory that Satan found disturbing. The early years of Jesus' life provided little clarity about divine strategy. Here was someone who appeared to be fully human, who grew and learned like any other child, who experienced the normal challenges of human development. Yet there were hints of something more. Glimpses of divine nature breaking through human limitations. Satan's confusion deepened as he observed this unique being. Every attempt to categorize or understand Jesus seemed to fall short. He was clearly human, yet there was something about him that transcended humanity. He was obviously divine, yet he submitted to human constraints. He possessed unlimited power, yet he chose to live in apparent weakness. The enemy's first major offensive came during Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. Here, finally, was the opportunity Satan had been waiting for. Just as he had tempted the first humans in a perfect garden, he would now tempt this divine human being in a desolate wasteland. Just as he had offered Eve the promise of becoming like God, he would now offer Jesus the kingdoms of the world. But something went wrong with Satan's carefully crafted strategy. The temptations that had proven irresistible to angels in heaven and humans on earth had no effect on this unusual target. Jesus didn't respond to appeals to pride, didn't succumb to offers of power, didn't doubt God's character in the face of difficult circumstances. More disturbing still was the method Jesus used to resist temptation. He didn't rely on his divine power to overwhelm Satan's attacks. Instead, he used the same weapon that was available to every human being, the Word of God. He demonstrated that Satan's lies could be defeated, not through superior force, but through simple trust in divine truth. This pattern of victory through apparent weakness became the hallmark of Jesus' entire ministry. He healed the sick, not by displaying overwhelming power, but through compassionate touch. He taught with authority, not by intimidating his listeners, but by revealing truth that resonated in their hearts. He demonstrated divine love, not through spectacular miracles, but through humble service to the least and the lost. Every act of Jesus' ministry was simultaneously a blow against Satan's kingdom and a revelation of God's character. When he forgave sins, he proved that divine mercy was real. When he healed diseases, he demonstrated that God's power was motivated by love. When he welcomed outcasts, he showed that divine grace had no boundaries. Satan found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. Every strategy he employed seemed to backfire. When he inspired religious leaders to oppose Jesus, their attacks only highlighted the contrast between human pride and divine humility. When he stirred up political opposition, it only emphasized the difference between earthly kingdoms and the kingdom of heaven. Most frustrating of all was Jesus' response to Satan's attacks. Instead of retaliating with force, Jesus responded with forgiveness. Instead of crushing his enemies, he prayed for them. Instead of establishing his authority through domination, he demonstrated it through service. This was a completely different approach to power than anything Satan had ever encountered. The enemy began to realize that he was fighting a war according to rules that his opponent wasn't following. Satan operated by the principles of pride, competition, and self-preservation. Jesus operated by principles of humility, cooperation, and self-sacrifice. It was like trying to play chess against someone who was playing an entirely different game. As Jesus' ministry progressed, the cosmic implications of what was happening became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about individual salvation or even human redemption. This was about the fundamental nature of reality itself. The way Jesus lived and taught and loved was providing a definitive answer to the questions that Satan's rebellion had raised about God's character. Every demonstration of divine love in Jesus' ministry was evidence against Satan's accusations. Every act of mercy was proof that God wasn't the selfish tyrant the enemy had claimed him to be. Every moment of grace was a vindication of divine character that had been called into question by the original rebellion. But Satan wasn't ready to concede defeat. If he couldn't corrupt Jesus through temptation, if he couldn't discredit him through opposition, then he would destroy him through execution. The cross became Satan's final gambit, his ultimate attempt to prove that God's love had limits, that divine patience could be exhausted, that the Creator would eventually respond to rebellion with the kind of violent retaliation that Satan himself would employ. The enemy marshaled all his forces for this final assault. He inspired Judas to betray Jesus, motivated the religious leaders to demand his death, and influenced the political authorities to carry out the execution. Every form of human evil was employed in the effort to destroy this divine human being who had posed such a threat to the kingdom of darkness. As Jesus hung on the cross, as his life slowly ebbed away, as darkness covered the land, Satan must have felt a surge of triumph. Finally, he had succeeded in striking back at God in a way that truly wounded the divine heart. Finally, he had proven that even God's love had limits. Finally, he had vindicated his original rebellion by demonstrating that the Creator was no different from any other ruler when pushed to his breaking point. But then, something happened that changed everything. Instead of cursing his executioners, Jesus forgave them. Instead of calling down divine wrath on his enemies, he prayed for their salvation. Instead of abandoning those who had abandoned him, he provided for their care. Even in death, even in apparent defeat, Jesus continued to demonstrate the very character that Satan had spent millennia trying to disprove. The cross, which Satan had intended as his ultimate victory, became instead the ultimate revelation of divine love. The moment that was supposed to prove God's character was flawed, instead provided the most compelling evidence in the history of the universe that God's love was absolutely perfect. The death that was meant to end the threat to Satan's kingdom instead sealed his eternal doom. In that moment of apparent defeat, the cosmic conflict reached its turning point. The questions that had been raised by Satan's rebellion were finally answered. The accusations that had been leveled against God's character were definitively refuted. The war that had raged for millennia was essentially won, even though its effects would continue to play out for generations to come. But the story didn't end with the cross. 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead, demonstrating that even death itself had no power over divine love. The resurrection wasn't just about individual victory over mortality. It was the cosmic declaration that the rebellion was finished, that Satan's power was broken, that the kingdom of darkness had been fundamentally defeated. The empty tomb became the ultimate symbol of God's victory in the cosmic conflict. Death, which had been Satan's most powerful weapon, was revealed to be powerless against divine love. The grave, which had seemed like the final word in the human story, was shown to be merely a temporary inconvenience for those who trust in God. With the resurrection, the nature of the cosmic conflict changed completely. The war was no longer about whether good would triumph over evil. That question had been settled once and for all. Now the conflict was about whether individuals would accept the victory that had already been won or continue to align themselves with a defeated enemy. Satan's position became untenable. He could no longer claim that God was unloving because the cross had demonstrated divine love beyond any possible doubt. He could no longer argue that God was unjust because the resurrection had vindicated divine righteousness. He could no longer suggest that rebellion was justified because the life and death and resurrection of Jesus had proven God's character to be exactly what he had always claimed it to be. The enemy's only remaining strategy was to prevent people from understanding what had happened, to keep them ignorant of the victory that had been won on their behalf, to maintain his influence through deception rather than through legitimate authority. But even this strategy was doomed to ultimate failure, because truth has a way of breaking through deception, and love has a power that lies cannot ultimately resist. The cosmic conflict that began with Lucifer's rebellion in heaven was essentially over. The war in heaven had been won not through displays of superior force, but through demonstrations of superior love. The questions raised by Satan's accusations had been answered not through logical arguments, but through the lived reality of divine character revealed in human experience. As we look at our world today, as we witness the ongoing effects of this ancient conflict, we need to understand that we're not seeing a battle where the outcome is still in doubt. We're seeing the death throes of a rebellion that has already been defeated. We're witnessing the final desperate struggles of an enemy who knows his time is short and his cause is lost. Every act of evil we see around us is not evidence that Satan is winning. It's evidence that he's losing, that he's growing more desperate, that he's running out of time and options. Every demonstration of hatred is a pale shadow compared to the love revealed at the cross. Every display of pride is pathetic when measured against the humility shown by the Creator. The war in heaven taught us that rebellion against God is ultimately futile. The war on earth has taught us that God's love is ultimately irresistible. The cosmic conflict that seemed like it might tear the universe apart has instead revealed the depths of divine character in ways that nothing else could have accomplished. The victory achieved through the cross and resurrection didn't just end the cosmic conflict, it transformed our understanding of what victory actually means. For millennia, Satan had operated under the assumption that power was about control, that authority came through force, that winning meant dominating your enemies. The incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ revealed a completely different paradigm of power, one that operates through love rather than coercion, through service rather than domination, through sacrifice rather than self-preservation. This is why the enemy continues to struggle against a battle that's already been decided. He's still fighting according to the old rules, still trying to win through deception and destruction, still attempting to prove his accusations against God's character. But those accusations have been definitively answered. The questions he raised about divine love, justice, and authority have been settled once and for all. What we're witnessing in our world today isn't a cosmic conflict where the outcome remains uncertain. We're seeing the final chapters of a story whose ending has already been written. Satan knows he's defeated, but he's determined to take as many souls with him as possible before his time runs out. Every lie he tells, every temptation he offers, every system of deception he establishes is a desperate attempt to maintain relevance in a war he's already lost. The implications of this victory extend far beyond individual salvation. The cross didn't just provide redemption for humanity, it vindicated God's character before the entire universe. Every created being, whether angel or demon, whether in heaven or in hell, now has undeniable evidence of what God is truly like. The accusations that sparked the original rebellion have been exposed as lies. The questions about divine character have been answered beyond any shadow of doubt. This is why we can face the future with confidence, despite the chaos we see around us. This is why we can stand firm in the midst of spiritual warfare, knowing that we're fighting from a position of victory rather than hoping for one. This is why we can love our enemies, forgive those who wrong us, and serve others sacrificially, because we're following the example of the one who has already won the ultimate victory. The war in heaven revealed the bankruptcy of pride and rebellion. The war on earth has revealed the power of humility and love. And now, as we await the final consummation of all things, we can live as citizens of a kingdom that has already triumphed, representatives of a king who has already conquered, and ambassadors of a love that has already proven itself stronger than every force of darkness. The forbidden history we've uncovered today isn't just ancient information. It's the key to understanding our present reality and our eternal destiny. We are not victims in this cosmic drama. We are victors in Christ, more than conquerors through Him who loved us and gave Himself for us. The war that began before the foundation of the world has been won, and we get to live in the light of that victory every single day.